Over the weekend it was pretty bad conditions on our Sunday afternoon, but it was the only time that I could go fishing. There was barreling westerly winds and a real drop in temperature. I was basically fishing the middle of the day and with a rising tide, so it narrowed down a lot of the spots and also the type of fish that I would target. Back in the day I probably would have just gone to my usual spot and caught F-all. These days I check the wind conditions, look at the tide and then choose a spot. I drove past one of my usual spots and it had the same wind direction for about 12 hours and it was all churned up. It was choppy because it was against the tide and you could see all the sticks and whatnot floating in the water. So I looked onto Google Maps and tried to find a protected area. With most windy rivers, you're always going to be able to find some form of protected spot from the wind. Also, given that it was the middle of the day and it was still quite warm, I thought flathead was the best target species. For this video I'm going to run through some different tips on choosing the best spots to fish the river and also run through how I check the conditions. For example, with this fish, the things I looked at was it was a rising tide and that I could fish the grassy edge, and I also knew that bait was going to be coming onto the flats. I also saw the barreling westerly wind and I figured I'd try and find a spot that was protected from the wind, but also a spot where I could use it to my advantage with casting distance. It was also close to a bend in the river where bait would be cruising past. With life and family, sometimes you only get a small window to go fishing, and often it won't be perfect conditions, so you really need to adapt. It's also a lot of fun when you catch something during a time when you think you were never going to catch anything at all. So when we're thinking about where to start, I think bends in the river are pretty reliable. So if you look right here, this is Salter Point. So for a fish to get one side of the river to the other, it's going to hug that boundary there. It also means that bait's going to congregate on those boundaries too. So if you're going to try and fish a river that you don't know a lot about when you're travelling around, look for different bends in the river or have a look at the different points around the river as well. Always a good place to start. Sand spits are also a good idea too. If you fished a river that you've never fished before, bridges are always the way to go. You've also got the narrowing of passages through the bridge, which means that the fish will be more concentrated, and also the added structure that you get from the pylons. When in doubt, fish the bridge. Here I was just travelling around in outer Sydney. I've never been to this spot before. Found a bridge, first or second cast. This well-known bridge in Perth is also a great representation of the structure that you've got here, which can also be challenging at times. One of the best spots to fish if you know nothing about the river is the river mouth. I was in New Zealand a few years ago and I was staying in Picton. Got up early and thought I'd have a little scout around on Google Maps to find a good spot. I knew nothing about the river, had no local knowledge, so I went to the river mouth. I knew there'd probably be car wire around, so I brought a few little Halco twisties and had a ball. Those narrow rivers which meet the ocean can be a great place for tailor, mulloway, big brim, flathead, all your bread and butter species. I caught both my PB flathead and yellowfin brim at a river mouth in the entrance in New South Wales. Again, I had no local knowledge. It looked really fishy, beautiful flats and drop-offs, but I knew where to start. Go to the river mouth. Some of my more general tips to river fishing is pack light. If you pack light, you can cover more ground and you can really give the spot justice. Rather than sort of just picking a 10 metre stretch, you can cover a couple of 100 metres. Also have a plan B. And when I say plan B, just think about what other spots around this area might be suitable. Say if you're here for an hour and a half and getting absolutely nothing, maybe try somewhere else. I would say when you are looking at a plan B or a plan C, just make sure it's pretty close by. So the more time you spend in your car, the less time you're fishing. But if it's 5 minutes away and you've got a plan B, give it a run. If you fish in your local river though, and you can actually see the bait, you can see bust ups and you know there's fish there, maybe change up your retrieve, change up your lure, lower your leader, so go from 10 pound to 4 pound, or change the species that you're targeting. If you can see this tailor busting up, chuck on a metal. If you dismiss a spot just because you had a bad day, you're going to miss out on fish. A couple of places where I've caught some of my biggest flathead have been spots where I've been out there for days and caught absolutely nothing. I could see the bait, I could see the lays from the flathead, and I knew there was fish there. When fishing a river, you've got to consider the upper or lower reaches as well. For example, here's the Hawkesbury River. In the lower reaches, you can get anything from kingfish, snapper, whiting. As you make your way up here, it's more black brim, estuary perch when you get to around that sort of lower Portland area. Further you get around, it's mainly bass and mullet, all those freshwater species out of the brackish water. By the time you get up to about Yarramundi here, you can even catch trout. So, same river, lots of different species. Level of the tide is probably one of the most important factors. It's not necessarily about choosing which spot to fish, but how you fish it. For example, if you've got a low tide here, I would probably walk out right to the edge of the flats here and fish the drop off. As the tide rises, I could slowly move back. So when it's at the top here, you'd probably fish right on those flats there. And depending on the wind direction, you might even stand out further on the flats and cast back into shore. So the wind direction will, like we talked about before, will determine which way I'm going to go. So for example, if the wind is coming from the west here, if I'm on the east side of this point here, the conditions are going to be much more calm and I don't have to cast into the wind. Having said that, sometimes casting into the wind can be helpful, depending how strong it is. For example, when trout fishing, I'll often cast into the wind because the wind will push the trout and the bait towards the bank. There's always a point of diminishing returns when it comes to the wind because you don't want to be getting wind knots every 5 minutes, and also it knackers you out much more. Having said that, flathead, trout and other species like that will push up against the boundaries when the wind is absolutely barreling in. So if it's a big expanse of water, fishing into the wind on a point can be really helpful. If I'm fishing and walking the flats, I tend to like to use the wind to my advantage for longer casting distance. I only really like casting into the wind for trout, maybe the flathead here and there if I'm walking along the edge, but it's not as fun. When fishing for bream and other species like that, find the structure. So here on the Swan, there's a lot of timber just here. So submerged trees, fallen logs, whatnot, always a great spot to start. You're probably going to lose lures here, but you're going to catch fish. So for example here, I'm throwing out a little surface lure as closest to the structure as I can get. Bass comes out from the log, smashes it. Other areas are rock walls. I like a shaded rock wall. Rising tide onto the rock wall is great too because of all the mussels and the crabs. Having said that, shade is always king. So when you're looking at areas of the river to fish, think about rock walls, branches, boats are a really good one. Maybe perfect your cast before you do that, otherwise you get a few people angry at you. Piles, markers, islands in the river as well. Another trick to fishing the shade line is to look what area of the river is going to be shaded in the morning and what area is going to be shaded in the afternoon. And if you can match that with wind direction, you're in for a winner. Every now and then you're still going to catch absolutely nothing. I think it's also important that you make sure you don't live too much by these rules or you're never going to find some other spots. For example, a lot of my great spots are against all these rules here. If you don't fish spots on different tides, you're never going to learn. And also you might find spots where a low tide is actually way better than the high tide and it doesn't make any sense. So don't let it exclude you, but if you do a few of these little tips, it'll definitely help out. Thanks for watching. For more Perth Metro, Swan River videos, please subscribe. Feel free to ask any questions in the comment section.